Hello and welcome back to another episode. And this week we are going to be talking about everything March Madness again, but I've compiled a list of things that I've noticed this year and also just kind of thinking back on last year, just some weird historical things that seem to happen repeatedly. And then we're also going to make a second chance bracket because, you know, what's life without second chances? All right, so first thing is the list. And this will be published on the webpage as well after I'm done recording. But I just wanted to go through what I have so far. And I have 9 things on this list already, which, I mean, maybe it's a little extensive, but, you know, the broadcasting channels, they always post stuff like this right before the games happen. They like to wait until then, and I think it's partially just to get people on edge that have made their brackets, being like, oh no, I picked the other team that this stat goes against, so now my bracket's screwed. But now this knowledge that I will compile will be available whenever, wherever. So the first thing is mid-majors versus the big schools. The mid-majors, since they're smaller schools, it's a lot easier for them to contend with the bigger teams if they have better guard play. So they rely on it because most of the time they lack size in comparison to bigger schools. So like a school like Oakland is a mid-major school, and they probably, like with their matchup against Kentucky, they didn't really match up as well in size, but they had great guard play, so they were able to keep that close. And they ended up beating Kentucky because of their guard play. They were able to just keep hitting those threes nonstop, and Kentucky they couldn't pull it out in the end. And with the D1 schools, they get the bigger guys, and they're able to get inside the paint and score easier when they're up against the mid-major schools. The second one, and this one I kind of made out of spite after the BYU game, and I call this the conference trench coat. So this is where a team that's in like a bigger conference, like a Power 5 conference, like Big 12, Big 10, ACC, I would say Pac-12, but Pac-12 is gone next year, so we can't really say that. But and the SEC, that's another one too. But teams in those larger conferences that make it, and they bring in like 8 or 9 teams, just an obscene amount of teams. And some of those teams in those conferences are smaller. So for this year, examples are like BYU. They're in the Big 12. Big 12 was seen as the best conference of basketball this year, and they went out in the first round against Duquesne. And not a lot of people saw that coming because people were like, oh, well, BYU's great on the outside. They had a tough schedule, and I was one of those people. And then kind of same thing with Texas Tech, except Texas Tech went down to a bigger conference team. Like they went down against NC State. But still, I still kind of consider Texas Tech in this example just because of how NC State was looked at in this tournament. I don't think they were expected to go very far just because of how long of a run they would have had to make in the ACC tournament, and they did 5 games in a row the week before. People were expecting them to come in tired, and they ended up surprising Texas Tech. And Texas Tech is weird, though, because sometimes they have really good years, and sometimes they just flop instantly. We can also look at the Big Ten for this as well. I mean, one of the reasons why I came up with this list and this specific point in the list was because of the Big Ten 2 years ago, when like half of the teams in the Big Ten went out in the first round. So, I mean, it's like those smaller teams in those conferences, they get into a bigger conference, they play a tough schedule, they make it into the tournament because they're in like the upper half, and their selling point is, well, our record is terrible, like our in-conference record is relatively terrible, but we still have beaten top 25 teams that are in our conference, so we should have a spot in the tournament. And then they lose in the first round. The third one is the media tries to sell upsets. Now, the first example to me that came to mind was the Gonzaga-McNeese upset. And people online were all over this one. This was probably the biggest upset that was sold. People like Gonzaga's not as good this year. McNeese is going to destroy them on offense. But Gonzaga did also have one of the top defenses in the country. So Gonzaga was able to pull out that win. And now, and this is kind of later on the list, but now Gonzaga has made the Sweet 16 9 times in a row up until today. Like they made it, this is the 9th time they've made it to the Sweet 16 in the March Madness tournament. The fourth one, and this one's kind of interesting, Kentucky has won a singular game in the 2020s in the March Madness tournament. And that was last year. They made it to the round of 32. And that was it. Every other time they've made the tournament in the 2020s, they've lost in the first round. And because of this, I think John Calipari's job might be in jeopardy, but I don't know. I think they like him down there so that he might stay, get a chance to prove himself. But I think it's weird that Kentucky is considered a blue blood, and in the 2020s, they have won only one game in the big tournament in this decade. The fifth one, the Ivy League conference champ, like their tournament champ, makes it to the round of 34, has made it to the round of 34 2 years in a row now. Last year, we saw this when Princeton upset Arizona, and they also made it to the Sweet 16. And this year, we saw Yale beat Auburn in the first round, but they did not make it to the Sweet 16. Otherwise, that would say the Sweet 16. The sixth one, this one's like more for me in a way, but it depends really on, I guess, how you pick. But for me, the first day of March Madness is better than the second one. So what I mean by that is like when I pick matches, all the matches that are slated for day one go relatively well. Whereas the second day, all like my bracket basically just falls apart most of the time. Like I get more matches right on the first day of the round of 64 than the second day of the round of 64. And this was kind of the same with the round of 32 as well. I got pretty much every single match right except for one on the first day of the round of 32. And basically none of them right on the second day of the round of 32. Also, the location of the games is important. I mean, we kind of went into the location of some of the games as well. I mean, we see Purdue just destroying the teams that they played, but if you watch the games, you could see that Purdue had a clear home court advantage. If you've ever been to a college basketball game, you know what that home court advantage is. That's where if an official makes a call, whether it's if it's good for your team, you're cheering really loud. If it's against your team, you boo nonstop the entire game. You chant BS for 5 minutes, just stuff like that. And the other team, they've got nothing. They don't have a home crowd to rally behind them. So I think once Purdue gets out of Indianapolis, which is 40 minutes away from their campus, so it's really easy for their students to go over there to get tickets and stuff, they could just pack the seats with Purdue fans. All right, so the seventh thing, Vermont. They always make it in pretty much every year, but they always get out in the first round. So these examples that I'm citing are from the 2020s, but in their whole history, I looked this up online, in their entire history in the March Madness tournament, whenever they are, it's not been consecutive years all the time, but whenever they're in, they always lose in the first round. In the 2020s, this year they lost to Duke. Last year in 2023, they lost to Marquette. And in 2022, they lost to Arkansas. Just something to know. And I, for some of my brackets, have Vermont beating Duke. And Now, after looking this up, I regret that. The eighth thing is, and this was the thing with Gonzaga that I said I was going to come back to, Mark Few has made this Sweet 16 9 times in a row. So pretty much every single time Mark Few has been on Gonzaga, they've made it to the Sweet 16 9 consecutive times. It doesn't matter where they're ranked. They've been ranked 1 before. They've been ranked 2. This year, they're ranked 5. They were ranked 4 last year. Wherever he was seated, he made it to the Sweet 16. And the last thing I have right now is the ACC always does well in March, whether or not they're hot or cold in the tournament. And the reason I add that last part is because Duke was one of those teams that was cold in the ACC tournament. So was Clemson. They were cold in the ACC tournament, but they're still in the Sweet 16 nonetheless. NC State, they're hot, and they're also in the Sweet 16. North Carolina is kind of in the middle just because they lost to NC State, and they had a pretty easy path in the ACC tournament otherwise. So I don't really count whether or not North Carolina is hot or cold. Plus, North Carolina, I mean, they're a blue blood, so they normally historically do well in March anyway. But yeah, that's the last thing that I have on my list. But I'm sure after the Sweet 16, there's going to be like 5 more things on that list. I wouldn't even be surprised. All right. Now we're going to go on and make a second chance bracket. So that's just the Sweet 16 onward. So for the first game, so we're going to start off in the East region just because that's where we started last time. We have San Diego State and UConn. And this is a rematch from last year from the national championship. But UConn has just been on the warpath this tournament, just destroying everyone they face. And I don't think that stops with San Diego State. I think UConn is going to whoop them even harder than they did last time. And it's partially because the Mountain West this year has been kind of an embarrassment, not going to lie, in the tournament. Next match, we have one of the best offenses in the country versus one of the best defenses in the country. And this match is Illinois versus Iowa State. Now, normally in March, I lean towards the defense because it is very easy to score points. Like if you have a better defense, your goal is to ice the other team. And even if you're cold, like you're just trying to stop them more than they can stop you. And I think like Illinois has made a surprising run just because from years past, they normally choke in the tournament. And I think this year, this is where Illinois' journey stops. I think Iowa State is going to stop them. I think their defense is just going to be too much for Illinois to handle. And Iowa State on offense, they are great from behind the three-point line. So if they get hot, then it will get really dangerous for Illinois when they play. So I'm going to take Iowa State over Illinois. Now for the West region, so this is just before we go to we're just going Sweet 16, then Elite 8, and then Final Four, and so on. So now we're going to the West region. We've got North Carolina versus Alabama. Now, I want to pick Alabama, but at the same time, I also want to see North Carolina and Arizona play in the Elite 8 just because of the drama between Caleb Love and North Carolina, since that's where he played last year. And Alabama lives and dies by the three-point line. North Carolina can score from wherever. So I think as long as North Carolina's defense holds up against Alabama, I think North Carolina should win this game anyway. So I'm going to take North Carolina. Then we've got Clemson versus Arizona. Now, I'm almost tempted to pick Clemson over Arizona just because the last team mascot that Arizona faced and lost to in March was the Tigers, Princeton. But I don't think that's going to happen this year. Arizona looks pretty good. I mean, when they get cold, they're They're pretty reliable on defense. I think just towards the end of the game, they give the ball to Caleb Love a little too much, and then defenses are able to get around him. But I think Clemson's little run ends with Arizona. I'm going to have Arizona going up against North Carolina. And looking at my bracket now, I am realizing how much chalk I have on the east and west sides of the bracket. All the 1s and 2 seeds going forward. Now we're going to go to the south. We have Houston versus Duke. Now, Duke, like I was saying earlier, doesn't matter if they enter hot or cold, but they have been performing more than I thought, like better than I thought they were going to in this tournament. But Houston is also a very elite team on both offense and defense. And it's really hard for me to pick against Houston in this matchup. And I think Houston, as long as they play aggressive, because I don't think Duke will be able to match Houston's aggression, I think Houston will beat Duke by 10. So I'm going to take Houston over Duke. Because when Houston's aggressive, I mean, we saw this against Kansas, they're unstoppable. And I think when they go up against Duke, they're gonna bring it. Now we've got NC State Marquette. Marquette is going a little bit further in this tournament than I thought they would. I thought they were going to be the 2-15 upset. And then for some of my other brackets, I had them losing in the round of 32 because normally Marquette chokes in the tournament. But they're going up against an NC State team that has been in the March mentality since the week before March. And I think that makes NC State a very dangerous opponent for Marquette. I think I'm going to go with the upset. I'm going to go with NC State over Marquette. I don't think they're done. They've looked good. Like, they have not missed a beat ever since the ACC tournament. I think they upset Marquette in a very close match. I could see that one going into overtime. Then we've got the Midwest region, the last region in the Sweet 16. And this first matchup is Purdue-Gonzaga. Now, before we go on, I just want to look at the matchup here, where the location is. This is in Detroit. So it's still kind of close for Purdue fans to go to. But I also like Gonzaga here in this match. I mean, they have beaten Kentucky. They beat St. Mary's. They've beaten Kansas, and they beat Kansas when they were at maybe 90%. But yeah, this one's tough because Purdue's made it further than I thought they were going to be completely honest here. But I think that for some reason, Purdue is going to get cold early. And I think Gonzaga is going to do a good job of isolating them. I think defensively, Gonzaga is going to give Purdue some problems on the three-point line. So I'm going to go with Gonzaga over Purdue here. Then we've got Creighton, Tennessee. Tennessee is also one of those teams that is making it further than I thought they were going to. Just because, again, recently, kind of like Purdue, they choke in the tournament. They don't do anything in those big moments. And I think they do lose to Creighton just because of Creighton. I mean, Creighton played a really tough game against Oregon. And even though I think they didn't look as good as last year, Creighton did hold their own defensively, and they were able to hold on long enough to get hot in the second overtime. So I think Creighton is going to be a great matchup against Tennessee, and I think Creighton's going to get the upset. And Creighton also, every year that I've seen them in the tournament, they move up one spot more. So they'd go from round of 64 Then the next year, they went to the round of 32. Then the next year, they went to Sweet 16. Then the next year, they went to Elite 8. And this year, I think that kind of trend is going to continue for Creighton. But we'll get back to that later. First, we have to go through the UConn-Iowa State game. Now, this was a pick that I made last week, and I don't think I'm going to change my mind on it. I still think Iowa State over UConn is a good pick. I think Iowa State is going to give UConn a lot of problems defensively. There's not a lot of teams that can cover both the perimeter and the interior well, and Iowa State can do both well. UConn attacks both well, so I think this will be a really good matchup in the Elite Eight. But I think Iowa State will come out on top. In the West, we have North Carolina, Arizona. In this one, I think just because Arizona is so close to Glendale, because the Final Four and championship are in Glendale, I think just because they can taste how close it is and they are going to want that home court advantage, I think Arizona's going to pull it out. I think their roster looks very complete going into this with this tournament. And I think with rest, it's only going to get better. I think North Carolina's going to get a little bit of a scare from Alabama, and that's going to affect the way they play against Arizona. So I'm going to take Arizona over North Carolina. Now I've got Houston, NC State, and this is where I think the Cinderella story for NC State ends. I don't think they match up really that well against Houston. Houston's really good all around. NC State, I feel like they rely a lot on DJ Burns. And I think Houston is going to be able to isolate him and keep him from making a lot of points in the field. So that's going to force NC State to rely on the three-point line. And they haven't been the best but from the perimeter. So I think Houston is the safe pick here. I'm going to have Houston going over NC State. Then for the last game of the Elite Eight, it's Gonzaga versus Creighton. Now, like I said earlier, Creighton has moved up one spot each year progressively in March Madness. And this year, they are going to go on to the Final Four. I think Creighton from behind the perimeter is going to be too much for Gonzaga. Creighton's offense is very unique because they do shoot from the perimeter and they shoot it well, but they do it in transition. So they get down the floor in like 3 seconds and then they just shoot a three and then it goes in. So they could score in like 3 seconds. So even though Gonzaga might be better defensively, I think Creighton is able to close gaps very, very quickly with the way that they score. And if they get in their rhythm, I don't see Gonzaga stopping them. So I'm going to have Creighton going into the Final Four to face off against Houston. Now I've got Iowa State versus Arizona, and I think this is where Arizona's run ends. I think Iowa State, unlike Arizona, can cover the perimeter. Arizona doesn't cover the perimeter well, and that's one of the main spots that Iowa State gets points from. So I think if Iowa State gets hot, which, I mean, they've looked good all tournament, so I don't see why they would stop. I think Iowa State is going to take down Arizona in a close matchup. And then for the last match in the Final Four, Houston versus Creighton, I think Creighton, you know how like when you're walking around, like when you walk upstairs, like you can either go like one step at a time or you go 2 steps at a time. Like I'm one of those people that walks every every other step on the stairs just because it's faster. I think Creighton does this with Houston. I think Creighton will, in this matchup, I think Creighton will get hot early against Houston. Houston won't know how to defend against Creighton well just because of how quickly they get down the court and shoot the threes. And if they get hot, Houston's going to have to call timeouts early to try to ice them. and it will get close at the end of the game. But Houston's not going to have enough timeouts to control the game at the end, so they're going to have to rely on fouls to slow the game down. And I could see some of Houston's guys getting into foul trouble early. So I think that would put them in a really dangerous position against Creighton. So I am going to have Creighton going into the championship to play Iowa State. For this last matchup, the championship, Iowa State versus Creighton. Like I've said earlier, Iowa State defends the perimeter well. I mean, Creighton does have some big guys, so if they're not hitting from three, they can go inside into the paint. But Iowa State can cover both very well. I think Iowa State is going to be able to hold Creighton down in the beginning, and Creighton will start to come back, but I don't think it'll be enough. So I'm going to have Iowa State taking down Creighton, making the Big 12 have another champion this year in the tournament. A big showdown between the Big 12 Conference and the Big East Conference. Now I have to put a total points, and I think just because of Creighton's scoring ability, I could see the game going up to a combined... this one's tricky. I could see this going up to 146-ish. Yeah. Yes, I think that's what's going to happen for this year's tournament, just going on for the rest of the year. Now we have... So, yeah, that's the last thing that I have today. Next week, we're probably going to be talking more basketball because, I mean, it's still going on. And I will update the list next week as well. I'll give you guys an updated list. And, yeah, that's all I've got for today. So I'll see you guys all next week. If you guys make a second chance bracket, good luck. And hopefully this one will be perfect. But it probably won't, just because nothing ever goes the way you think it does in March, no matter how hard you try. So, good luck, and I'll see you guys next week.